date is May 1816. Joe Bodenland has been swept by a time slip from the 20th century back into the probability world of Victor Frankenstein. Frankenstein's creation, the monster, is already at large in the wilds of Switzerland. Justine, a servant in the Frankenstein's employ, is wrongfully condemned to death for the murder of Victor Frankenstein's little brother, William. The murderer is, in fact, the monster, whose very existence Frankenstein wants to keep secret at all costs, even from Elizabeth Lavenza, his fiancée. Frankenstein is moping in the mountains outside Geneva when Joe Bodenland encounters him.
Who are you? And what do you want with me? Are you from the court?
Herr Frankenstein, my name is Bodenland, Joseph Bodenland. We met at the hotel yesterday. I apologize for intruding upon you.
No matter if you have news. Is a verdict out yet?
Yes. Justine has been condemned to death. The verdict was the inevitable one, in view of your silence.
What do you know of my affairs? Who sent you here?
I'm here on my own account, and I know little of your affairs, except the one crucial thing which nobody else seems to know, the central secret of your life.
Are you another phantom, sent to plague me? A product of my imagination?
Ah, you're sick, man. Because of your sickness, an innocent woman is going to die, and your fair Elizabeth is going to be plunged into misery.
What do you know of my inner torment? Rendered all the worse by the high hopes I once had. The desire to wrest from Mother Nature some of her deepest secrets, however dark the passage down which I might tread. What cared I for myself? Truth was everything to me. I wanted to improve the world, to deliver into man's hands some of those powers which had hitherto been ascribed to a sniveling and fictitious god. I made my bed in charnels and on coffins, that a new Promethean fire might be lit. What man ever achieved what I have achieved? And you speak of my sins.
Why not? Isn't your ambition itself a sin? You admitted your own guilt, didn't you?
Since I am an atheist and do not believe in God, I do not believe in sin in the sense you intend the word. Nor do I believe that the zeal of discovery is a cause for shame. But guilt I believe in. Oh, yes. I sometimes think that guilt is a permanent condition with me, and possibly with all men in their secret hearts. Perhaps religions have been invented to try to exorcise that condition. It is guilt, not age or misunderstanding, that withers cheeks and drives friends and lovers apart. Yet, why should this condition be? Whence does it come? Is it a modern thing? From now onwards, are all generations to feel guilty because man's powers grow generation by generation? So much have we achieved, so much more is there to achieve. Must that achievement always carry the maggot of guilt with it? Or perhaps guilt has always been a condition of man. Since the early days of the world, before time rolled out like a long slumber across the universe. Perhaps it is to do with the nature of his conception, and with the lustful coming together of man and woman.
Why do you suppose that?
Because that intense pleasure which procreation gives is the moment when human beings shed their humanity and become as the animals, mindless, sniffing, licking, grunting, copulating. My new creation was to be free of all that. No animal origins, no guilt.
You have a singularly repulsive view of humanity. Is this perhaps why you will do nothing to save Justine?
I cannot go to the syndics. I cannot.
At least tell the woman whom you love. There must be trust between you.
Tell Elizabeth I would die of shame. I am discomposed, or I would not speak as I have. I mean to arm myself from this day on, be warned, lest you are tempted to trespass on my confidence. Now, I pray, leave me.
From then on, many alarming and confusing things happen to Joe Bodenland. He wishes to set right the injustice he has witnessed. in this strange probability world of 1816, where what Bodenland thought were fictitious people mingle with real ones, there is one person at least who might help him, Mary Shelley, the youthful author of the novel Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. There is another minor time slip, but eventually Bodenland presents himself at the Villa Diodati, where Lord Byron is staying by the lakeside. Percy Shelley and Mary, as yet Shelley's mistress and not his wife, stay nearby. With the two poets is John Polidori, an Italian doctor, and Claire, Byron's mistress and Mary's half-sister. Bodenland is invited to eat with Mary, Byron, and Shelley. Nothing pleased me more than to be allowed to take supper with them. They were interested in my opinions, but not in my circumstances, so that I did not have to invent any tales about my past. Polidori came down to supper and sat next to me without saying anything. He and I were eating heartily when Byron threw down his fork.
Oh, for the horrors of polite society again. At least they knew how to treat meat. This is a mockery of mutton.
Ah, lampoon.
That's a very beefy pun for a vegetarian.
In a few generations, all mankind will be vegetarian.
Yeah.
Once it is generally realized that the animals are such close kin to us, then meat eating will be disdained as too near to cannibalism for comfort. Can you imagine what a civilizing effect that will have on the multitude? 100 years from now, the march of the physical sciences. Oh, Albay, you should have talked to old Erasmus Darwin about that subject. He foresaw the time when steam would invade every domain.
Just as it invaded this mutton.
Steam is the basis of all the present-day improvements. Mind you, it's only the very beginning of revolutionary improvement in all things. We who have harnessed steam are now harnessing gas as another powerful servant, and we are merely the precursors of generations who will harness the great life force of electricity.
Well, that's pretty good going. That's air, water, and fire. What are our enlightened descendants going to do about the fourth element, Earth? Will they find some use for it, rather than burying moldy bodies in it?
The Earth will be free to everyone. Don't you see? Oh, Mary, you explain.
I think...
With the elements as slaves, then for the first time in history, slavery will be abolished. Human servitude will disappear, for servitors in the form of machines powered by steam and electricity will take over. And that means that a day of universal socialism will dawn. For the first time, there will be no masters and inferiors. All will be equal.
I doubt God ever intended that. He gives no sign of it.
It's not God's intentions, it's man's intentions. As long as man's intentions can be made to be good. It's man that has to put nature right, you know, and not vice versa. We're all responsible for this fabulous world on which we have been born. I see the time coming when the human race will rule as it should rule, as benevolent gardeners with the great garden in its care. And then perhaps, like the adventurers of Lucian, we can skip to the moon and cultivate that, and the other planets of the sun.
Don't you think mankind will have to change its basic nature a little before that happens, Percy?
What I'm saying, Albay, is that machines will free all men, all the mute, inglorious Miltons of Gray's poem. And then there will not be room at the head of a reformed social system for duds and vipers like North or Castlereagh. Ability will be able to speak unmuffled. Honesty will be respected. Youth will not be shackled because the distortions of the present order will be abolished. Utterly abolished.
Is it possible that machinery will banish oppression? The question is whether machines strengthen the good or the evil in man's nature. So far, the evidence is not encouraging, and I suspect that new knowledge may lead to new oppression. The French Revolution was intended to remedy the natural order, but it changed very little. It certainly did not stop the corruption of power.
But that is because the French still insist on having a top and bottom. Now, socialism will change all that. Now, just remember, it is the present order which is unnatural. We are working towards a more natural order where inequality is done away with. By the time you and I are old men...
I'll have shot myself before that.
By the time this century is finished, the whole planet... Well, little Wilmouse will live to see it. Well, let's hope. There are entirely new powers hovering in the air, condensing in the future, lurking in the minds of man, which can be summoned as Prospero summoned Ariel.
Don't forget he summoned Caliban, too. What happens if these new powers are seized by those in power already? who, after all, are in the best position to seize them.
But that is why we need a new social order, Alday. Then the new power goes to all alike. What do you say to all this, Mr. Bowdenland?
In one major respect, I'm sure you're right, Mr. Shelley. The new systems of machines now coming in have great power, and it is a power to change the world. In the cotton towns, you can already see that power looms are creating a new category of human being, the town laborer. As the machines become more complex, so he will become more of an expert. His experience will be centered on machines. Eventually, his kind will become adjuncts of the machine. Not only will human goodness be unable to operate effectively on such a system, it will become increasingly irrelevant to it. First, the systems become impersonal, then they seem to take on a mind of their own, and they become positively malignant.
Then we're heading for a world full of Frankenstein monsters, Mary. Oh, for God's sake, let's take another drink, or shoot the dogs, or call Claire in to dance the fandango rather than indulge ourselves in this misery. Is not the past of the human race gloomy enough for you without supping upon the imaginary horrors of its future?
Milton's sympathies would be with you, Albie. Let no man seek henceforth to be foretold what shall befall him or his children.
But my feelings are different, if I may state them. When knowledge becomes formulated into a science, then it does take on a life of its own, often alien to the human spirit that conceived it.
Oh, yes, and always the pretense that the innovating spirit is so noble and good, whereas the cellars of creativity are often stuffed with corpses.
Don't talk to me about corpses. Who knows, but they may be lined up outside that very wall, waiting to flock in on us. I know about corpses. As the cycles of the air distribute moisture about the planet, so the legions of the dead march underground to distribute life. Do I sound so optimistic that I'm not always conscious of the short step between swaddling bands and cerements? Mortality! That's always the stumbling block. Your Frankenstein was correct in his basic idea, Mary. He sought first to create a race free from the bounds of ordinary human weakness. Would I had been so created! How I would stalk the world! Farewell!
Think yourself lucky he don't eat meat, Ma'am, or there's no knowing what he'd be up to.
Percy's so ethereal. I fear the world invisible is more visible to him than to the rest of us. I'd better go and calm him down.
Mary, dear, one night when I've made a better meal than I did tonight, I plan to go a little berserk, too, in order to have your solace.
Oh, Claire will look after you.
Bowdenland is given a bed in the Shelley villa. Next morning, he comes downstairs and finds Mary, with her blouse open, feeding her baby. Her eyes were grey, her whole expression animated and a little skittish, or so I thought, from the moment she observed me admiring her breast. With me, she had none of the shyness she had exhibited in Byron's company the evening before. You spoke little during our talk last night, yet I know you had much to contribute.
It was my place to listen, and I wished to listen. Shelley was not at his best, yet he always talked so beautifully.
Yes, he's very optimistic about the future.
Perhaps he makes it appear so. Come and sit by the window with me. And tell me, what is it you wish to say? Is it something about Shelley? No. It is something touching on our conversation last night. You don't know it, but my hair stood on end when you spoke of the future as you did. You conjured up for me the legions of the unborn, and I found them as grisly a sight as the legions of the dead. Although, like Shelley, I am not a believer in the Christian religion, as no intelligent person can be in our day, I do give strong credence to spirits. Until you enlighten me, and perhaps even after that, I shall regard you as some kind of spirit.
That might be the best way to look at it. Maybe I can never convince you that I'm other than a spirit, What I have to tell you is this, that I've come from 200 years in the future to speak to you, to sit here by this window and talk as we talk now. I could not resist letting flattery creep into my tone. Seen in the soft green light of the window, speaking with her serious, calm air, Mary Shelley was beautiful to behold. There might be a melancholy here, but there was none of Shelley's madness, none of Byron's moodiness. She seemed like a being apart, a very sane but extraordinary young woman, and the slumbering thing in my breast woke and opened to her.
You must have documents to prove your claim, to show at whatever unlikely temporal frontier post you came through on your way here.
Of course I do, and better than documents. But the document that most interests me is your novel, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus.
About that, you will have to give me more details. How you have heard of my story, I do not know, for it lies unfinished upstairs, although I began it in May. Indeed, I may never complete it now that we have to move back to England to sort out our difficulties there.
You will finish it. You will. I know as much. For I come from a time when your novel is generally acknowledged as a masterpiece of literature and prophetic insight. A time when Frankenstein is as familiar a name to the literate as Gulliver or Robinson Crusoe is to you.
My story is famous?
It is famous, and your name is honored.
Mr. Bowdenland. Joe, let's go and walk by the water's edge. I need some physical activity to prove I am not dreaming.
She was shaking. I took her arm as we passed through the door. She closed it and leaned against it, looking up at me in an unconsciously provocative attitude.
Can it really be as you say, that fame, that vicarious life in another's breath, will be mine in the years to come? And Shelley's? I'm sure his fame can never die.
Shelley's fame has always been secure, and his name forever linked with Lord Byron's. But your fame ranks with Shelley's. He is regarded as one of the foremost poets of science, and you as the first novelist of science.
Shall I live to write more than one novel, then?
Yes, you will.
And when shall I die? And dear Shelley, shall we die young?
You will not die before your names are known.
And will we marry? You know he pursues other women in his ever-questing way.
You will marry. Your name goes down into the future as Mary Shelley. She began to talk rapturously. She laughed and cried, and I laughed with her. There was a union, a chemical bond between us, which nature seemed to acknowledge and conspire with, for the wind dropped, and the sun blazed forth, and the great hills with their snowy caps shone forth in magnificence. Without conscious intention, I took her in my arms and kissed her. Her lips were warm and sweet. She responded before breaking away.
Come, my messenger, who brings me such reason for deep happiness. We will swim in the lake. You know Shelley cannot swim. I swim here with Byron because I dread to swim alone and tolerate all his impudent remarks. The water's deep and cold as a grave here. Do you mind? We will turn our backs to each other. So be polite while we strip.
She entered the water with a small cry at its chill. Splashing her limbs to get used to the cold, she turned and looked at me with a hint of mischief as I stood naked staring at her. Our gaze met and became an eternal thing. That's how I see her now, turning to look over a white shoulder with the placid expanse of lake about her. I ran forward and dashed myself into the water with a skimming dive. After our swim, we ran back to the little villa, laughing and clutching our clothes. She found me a towel upstairs. I didn't use it, nor she hers. Instead, we lay on the bed together, embracing, mouth to mouth. Time and the great day fluttered round our bodies. There was a moment later when I found a willow leaf stuck to her still moist haunches. I set it carefully on the edition of Sophocles by her bed, intending to retrieve it later. I shall keep it, since it comes from enchanted ground.
Enchanted, indeed. You and I are under an enchantment, Joe. We do not exist in the same world. both of us are spirits, though you kiss my flesh. And we are swallowed up from the world, carried in this room to a glade of an enchanted forest, magnificent and unbounded, where stand groves of pine and walnut and chestnut. Nothing can harm us here. The forests are infinite. They go on to the end of the world and the end of eternity. The sun will never swing away from that casement window, for we have abolished time at a stroke, my dearest spirit.
Ah, Mary, Mary Shelley, how dear you were and are, beyond all women. And yet what was possible then was only possible because we were mere phantoms in the world, or so we saw it, and scarcely less than phantoms to each other. But the solid Swiss world was no phantom, nor would the solar system cease forging steadily through interstellar space. The sun did swing away from our casement, for all that Mary said, for all our forgetting of time, and the baby awoke and cried, so that Mary, giving me a languorous look, dressed herself carelessly and descended the stairs. I remember how her dress lit the stairwell, reflecting onto the wall the sunbeams that fell on it as she descended. I followed her down. The idyll between Bowdenland and Mary cannot last. Bowdenland must return to Geneva, and the English party are leaving for England. Jo will never see her again. Nor can she help him greatly concerning Frankenstein. Her book lies as yet unfinished. They part reluctantly. Back in the city, Bowdenland finds himself at once in trouble. Since he's been marked out as a suspicious person, he's flung into prison for the murder of Victor Frankenstein, who has disappeared. Bowdenland escapes following another time slip, during which cold and flood invade the city, and uncharted frigid lands materialize just beyond it. One midnight, Bowdenland tracks down Frankenstein just as Victor is leaving his house. I ran across the road and jumped up, clinging to the side of the phaeton. He reached over for a whip in its cup.
Frankenstein, it is I, Bowdenland. You remember me? I must speak to you.
You! Damn you! I thought it was... Well, no matter. What the devil do you want at this hour of the night?
I mean you no harm. I have to speak to you.
This is no hour for conversation. I do not wish to be seen here, do you understand me? I will set you down at the west gate.
You never wish to be seen. That's part of your guilt. Because of your elusiveness, I was charged with your murder. Did you know that? They shut me in your filthy prison. Did you know that? Did you make any attempt to get me free?
I have my own affairs, Bowdenland. Yours mean nothing to me. People murder and get murdered. So they have done since the world began. It's one of the things that must be altered. And I'm too busy to concern myself with your affairs.
My affairs are your affairs, Victor. You will have to accept me. I know about the monster that haunts your life.
So you hinted when last we met. Don't think I didn't hope that you might be buried in the prison forever or hanged for the murder of which you were accused. I have miseries enough. My life is doomed. I've worked only for the common good, humbly trying to advance knowledge.
There were crates with us in the carriage. He was escaping from home again.
Your good intentions do you credit, Victor, and yet you are always in flight.
I'm in flight against the evil of the world. I cannot take you where I am going. I must put you down.
Please allow me to come. I shall not be shocked because I already know what you are up to. Can't you see that I'd be better off with you than going to Elizabeth and telling her the truth?
You're no more than a blackmailer.
My role is not a glamorous one. I'm forced into it as you are forced into yours.
It began to slow lightly again, and we had no protection from it. The horse took a sidetrack which led uphill. We bumped to the top of it. As we pulled through a grove of bedraggled trees, The horse shied violently.
Curse you! Did you see it? Where I am, it is. It haunts me.
I saw nothing.
Inhuman and abhorrent thing. It was steaming. Even this cold weather cannot quell it. It thrives on anything that man detests.
Our present track led to a tower. It loomed dimly in the night and snow. I could make out that it was cylindrical. Behind, a square building had been added, an ugly piece of architecture with only one window, slitted and barred, set close by enormous double doors. We had reached Frankenstein's laboratory. In the laboratory, Bodenland gets a glimpse of Frankenstein's gruesome methods. But there is method. He realizes that Frankenstein is more scientific in his pursuits than he had imagined. More scientific and more obsessional. Frankenstein tells him how the monster escaped and learned to read such books as John Milton's Paradise Lost, which, he says, cast a damaging spell on the monster's untutored mind.
Untutored? How can you claim that? Isn't your creature's brain stolen from a corpse that once had life and thought?
Nothing's left from that previous existence. Only the mere lees and dregs of thought, dreams of past time that the creature does not heed, or not half as much as the figments he has derived from Milton. He now has himself cast in the role of Satan, and I in the role of God Almighty. And he demands that I create for him a mate, a gigantic Eve, to give him solace. But what a project! To improve on one's first blundering attempt.
You're mad! Do you want two fiends after you instead of one? At present, your monster has reason to spare your life. But when you've equipped him with a wife, why, it'll be in his interest to kill you.
How can you comprehend the difficulties of my situation? The creature has uttered the direst of threats. Not against my life, which is of little account, but against Elizabeth's. I will be with you on your wedding night. That was what he said. If he cannot have a wedding, he will not allow mine. If I will not bring his bride to life, then he will rob my bride of her life.
You already have one implacable enemy. In me you will have a second, unless you agree that we go tomorrow into the city and lay this entire matter before the syndics. Do you plan to populate the world with monsters?
You're being too hasty, Bodenland.
The men quarrel. Bodenland gets into the laboratory at the top of the tower, where he discovers a huge figure of a female monster awaiting vitalization. It bears the face and head of the servant girl, Justine, who has been executed because Frankenstein kept silent. It is then that Bodenland resolves to kill Frankenstein. Later, in a fury, the monster kills Frankenstein's servant in the snow outside the tower. When Frankenstein curses it, the monster howls for mercy.
Let me enter into the tower, my creator. Let me see you bring life to the mate. I know you have prepared man-like, but different sex, so lovely fair. And then, since you cannot find it in your heart to love me, we will go our separate ways for ever and ever, never to meet more. You shall go where you will. I will dwell in the frigid lands with my bride. No man shall ever set eyes on us again.
Very well. So shall it be. Since it cannot be otherwise, I will give life to the female. Then you must go and never more afflict my sight.
Lost. I will feel only gratitude, that I swear. The thought that torments me, I will forget. I am your slave. How I wish but once before you vanish, we might converse together on fragrant subjects. What a world you might open up to me. If all we ever speak of together is guilt and death, I know not why. Speak to me what did loving told of better things.
Don't fawn. Stand away. You must come with me into the tower to accomplish this foul work, since Yet is slain. I need your aid stoking the boilers to keep the electricity at full voltage. Enter and be silent.
Together, Monster and Frankenstein enter the tower. Bodenland lurks by his car, preparing to shoot them both when they reappear. But something upsets his plans. So time passed. The hours slid slowly down the great entropy slope of the universe. The snow ceased. Great flat-topped sheets of cloud were moving out of the frigid lands, intermittently obscuring the moon. The scene by the tower was rendered in untrustworthy washes of light. Frankenstein's monster stood outside the shattered door. He was not looking at me at all. He stared back into the dark from which he had emerged. I thought that one of his arms was extended. He took a pace back to the door. There was a hesitancy in his manner which was entirely strange. Someone took his hand. A figure emerged from the doorway. A figure almost as gigantic as he. It staggered, and he caught its elbow. They stood together, heads almost touching. He made her walk to and fro. I saw their breath on the frosty air. He was supporting her, an arm about her enormous waist. Her lumbering footsteps kicked up small flurries of snow. Moonlight washed over her features, making of her eyes a perfect blank. It no longer looked like Justine. Another life occupied it. The monster returned, bearing a goblet. He forced her to drink despite her protests. She drank, and he flung the glass down, standing back from her to see what she did. She came uncertainly forward, step by step, feeling for her balance. She stood, arms extended but bent, and slowly moved her head from side to side. She turned with an automatic movement and began to walk, swaying from side to side at first, but gradually gaining a more regular rhythm. He began to run about in front of her, to turn, to perform grotesque dance movements that were not without some grace. She came to him hesitantly, and he took both her hands in his. Hesitantly, they began to trip from side to side, facing each other, he always encouraging her, like two lunatic children in a dance. After a rest, the pair began to dance again. Then he released her and ran about as slowly as he could. She followed ponderously. Once she fell over, sprawling in the snow. He was upon her instantly, lifting her up with tender, clumsy care, holding her scarred head against his cheek. He urged her to run again. He cantered behind the tower. She followed. She was cautious at first, but her movements were coordinating rapidly. She found she could wave her arms as she ran. He stood back to watch in admiration, hands on tattered knees. Her actions were less clumsy now, her movements faster. She stopped suddenly. He clasped her about the waist. She pushed him away with a gesture that would have felled a man. There she stood, moving her arms, her wrists, her hands, like a Balinese dancer at practice. She was grotesquely dressed in what I took to be nothing more than the two sheets that had covered her on the bench, clumsily knotted about her vast frame. Perhaps because of that, there was something poignant in those androgynous movements, parodying grace. The tempo grew wilder. They danced away from each other. They danced towards each other. Occasionally, one would flick snow at the other, though by now the snow was well trampled over a wide area. As their motions became faster, so they moved in wider and wider gyrations. They were nearing the car now, plunging towards it, backing away, seeing nothing but each other. I was too hypnotized to move. My plan to use the swivel gun was gone from my head. When she came very near, I had a clear view of her face, turned brightly to the moonlight. There I read conflicting things. It was the intent face of a female in rut, yet it was also the face of Justine, impersonal with death. If anything, his face was even more horrific, lacking as it did all but a travesty of humanity. Despite his animation, it still most resembled a helmet, a metal helmet with visor down, roughly shaped to conform to the outlines of a human face. The helmet had a tight slit across it, resembling a smile. They joined hands. They twirled round and round and round and round. She broke away, uttering that mooing noise. She began to circle the tower again. Again he followed. The wolves were howling, closer at hand. Their discord provided accompaniment for the chase that now developed between the two beings. She darted round and round the tower, running fast but waving her hands. He kept close behind, not exerting himself. As the pace hotted up, panic entered her movements. She began to run in earnest, he to follow in earnest. I cannot say at what speed they moved, or how many times she circled the base of the tower, running as if her life depended on it. Finally, when his hand was on her shoulder, she half turned, slapped his arm away, and made as if to burst inside the tower for sanctuary. He seized her in the doorway. With one great heave of his hand, he ripped her flimsy garments from her. I saw that her reluctance to be taken had been feigned, or part feigned, for she stood before him naked and brazen, and began again a slow weaving movement of her limbs without departing from where she stood. I could see the great livid wheels of scars running across the small of her back and down her mighty thighs. He remained in a half-crouch, watching her, the smile of the helmet very narrow now. Then he sprang, bearing her down into the trampled snow, only a few paces from Yet's body. That narrow smile was pressed to the scars on Justine's throat. She half rose at one point, but he bore her down again. A light, uneasy wind licked through the bushes. It was a brief and brutal mating. Then they lay on the ground like two dead trees. Later, the two monsters escape. Bodenland kills Frankenstein and so finds himself constrained to take on Frankenstein's role of avenger. He follows the two monsters into the frigid lands, where the pursuit ends on an uncharted sea of ice. Far away across the ice field was a mighty building. I halted the animals. From where I stood, it was hard to grasp the size of that distant structure. It appeared to be round and to consist of little more than an immense outer wall. It was certainly inhabited. From within the walls came a glow of light, almost an atmosphere of light, reddish in color and punctuated by intenser beams of brightness moving within the central cloud. Elsewhere, dull depression reigned. Yet this was no bastion of light. For all its brightness, it too, I attempt no paradox, radiated drabness. My speculation was that this was the last refuge of humanity. The place was so remote that I could only believe the time slips to have delivered me at a point many centuries, maybe thousands or even millions of centuries into futurity, so that I might be witnessing the last outpost of mankind after the sun had died, when the universe itself was far gone towards the equipoise of its death. As I moved forward at a better pace, it occurred to me to wonder why the enemy should have led me here to a refuge, rather than onward to destruction. Could it be that they also were intending to enter this place? Or were they waiting somewhere, to tear me apart before I reached shelter. I went cautiously, for we were approaching a nun attack, and I feared ambush. I brought up my automatic in a gloved hand. But there was no sign of the two monsters. I unloaded the swivel gun and carried it to the top of the nun attack, sheltering it from the falling snow with my canvas packs. To protect myself from the cold to some extent, I climbed into my sleeping bag before lying down. Then I peered through the telescopic sights and endeavored to find trace of my quarry. There they were. Their figures were difficult to discern against the great dark walls ahead, but their outlines were fitfully picked up by the red light, as the moon first shows itself in a crescent form. They had reached the city and were about to go in. A new suspicion came upon me. I had no guarantee that this city was built by human hands. To what human city would these two outcasts go in such a manner? This was a city that would welcome them, that indeed might be heralding them by a tremendous extravagance of light. I jammed a magazine into the breech of the gun. Its code told me that 1 bullet in 5 was tracer. A gate was opening in the distant city. From beyond it, light poured over the two enormous figures. I began firing as they started to enter. A bright line of fire plunged across the intervening space. I saw the first bullet strike. One of the figures, the woman, seemed to blaze. She spun about. Her arms jerked up in anger. More tracer poured into her. She appeared to break apart as she fell. He also was hit, but he ran away from the light, so that I no longer had a silhouette as target. I'd lost him. Then the sight found him again. He was coming. Making full use of that terrible deadly speed, he was racing across the ice towards me, arms and legs plunging in a speed no human could rival. There was a glimpse of that cruel, grinning helmet of a face as I wrenched the barrel round for better aim. It stuck. Cursing, I looked down. One side of my sleeping bag had caught in the gun's track. It was a moment's work to tear it loose, but in that moment, he was nearly up to me. With a strength almost beyond myself, I raised the gun and fired it from my hip. The tracer caught him as he charged up the slope. Fire burned at his chest, and he fell backwards, tearing at his burning clothes. Touching my automatic, I went slowly down to where that great figure lay. It stirred now, turned over, drew itself into a sitting position. Its face was black. Smoke obscured it.
He's trying to destroy what you cannot understand. You destroy yourself. Only that lack of understanding makes you see a great divide between our natures. When you hate and fear me, you believe it is because of our differences. No, Bowden lad. It is because of our similarities that you bring such detestation to bear upon me.
He could not rise. A hollow cough burst from him, and a change took place in that abstract helmet which was his face. The sutures of Frankenstein's surgery parted. Ancient cicatrices opened at every contour. The whole countenance cracked, and I saw slow blood ooze in the apertures. He put a hand up, not to his cheeks, but to his chest where the greater pain was.
We are of different universes. I am a natural creature. You are a horror, unalive. I was born. You were made.
Our universe is the same universe where pain and retribution rule. Our deaths are both at quenching out. As for our birth, when I first opened my eyes, I knew I existed, as did you. But who I was, or where, or from what cause, I knew not, and no more did you. And as for those intervals between birth and destruction, my intentions, however warped, are more lucid to me than yours to you, and I suspect you know not compassion. This I will tell you, that through you all men, you are deemed fit to rejoin your kind, that my death will weigh more heavily upon you than my life. No fury I might possess could be a match for yours. Moreover, though you seek to bury me, yet will you continuously resurrect me. Once I am unbound, I am unbounded!
The fallen creature heaved himself to his feet and stood confronting me, fire still creeping at his chest and throat. Although he was below me on the slope, he dominated me.
There will be no more of you.
I fired 3 times, aiming into that voluminous greatcoat. He went down onto one knee and clutched his head. When he looked up again, one side of his face, it appeared to me, had fallen away. Sudden triumph and calm filled me. The monster was finished, and my quest. Trembling, I set the swivel gun to rights. If other attackers came for me, they should meet the same reception as the monster before I met my maker. Or there might be men in the city. I must assume nothing more until more was known. So I would wait here until someone or something came for me, biding my time in darkness and distance.